Welcome to the Listening to Smile podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Fallon Morningstar.
And I'm Ian Morris.
We have a very special guest, and funny enough, how the universe works, I was able to connect with Rachel through a women's conference. She had some of her colleagues attend that, and we actually got connected. So it's very beautiful and synchronistic, and we're happy to have her on the show today. We have Rachel Harrison from Trauma Specialists. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here.
So we will link your full bio in the show notes, but we would love you to just go over who you are and really what you do.
Yeah, sure. I have been a therapist for about 26 years, and about 10 years into my practice, I learned about EMDR therapy. And that was so life-changing for myself and my clients that I created a practice around that. I've had a few practices in my lifetime in a few different states, but in 2016, I created Trauma Specialists, and that was to focus on really zeroing in on trauma treatment. At the time, it was really not, trauma was not talked about in the way that it is now, and so it felt like a pretty big risk to say, like, this is what I want to do. And so many other places were like, so and such family therapy or just Frederick family therapy, those kinds of things. And I was like, trauma specialist is what I'm calling this. Is it going to scare people away, right? Is it going to make people go, oh, that's not me? Because we do provide all kinds of therapy, but it has turned out to be amazing. And some of the vision was really to make sure that all of our therapists knew EMDR therapy. I'm sure we'll dig into what EMDR therapy is a little bit more, but the long and short of it for me was that I wanted to be able to actually treat trauma, and that is what EMDR lets us do. Not just provide supportive skills and coping skills to people, which is also fantastic and important, but to actually change the way that that trauma is held in their brains and their bodies. And so that's the work that we do. And since then, I've launched a training institute. So we actually train providers all over the world to do the same kind of treatment that we do in treating trauma. So it's been, I guess, a passion for me to say that trauma really influences our communities. And if we can heal that, we can see big changes, I think. And so that's kind of me in a nutshell. That's what I'm passionate about. I love the business side, but I also love the treatment side. So it's kind of a both and for me.
Yeah, I love that. Was there a certain pivotal moment in your journey where you were like, I need to open a practice? Or because I feel like, as we'll get into our story on your podcast shortly, it's almost like we go through these hard times and then we feel like this is what we need to do because we have such a close tie to that, right? So do you have a pivotal moment in your journey when you're like, I need to open a practice? And then, you have several practices in different states. So how has that moment, that pivotal moment really expanded to say like, trauma needs to be in these various communities?
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't know if I can point to one specific moment. I think it was a little more like I kind of envision it like the idea of filling a cup, right? There were all these little experiences that kind of added up and sort of poured out into this. So I mentioned I had been a therapist for a long time before even learning EMDR and going on that journey. And I think that seeing client successes with the new tools is part of what started to build that. And I started thinking about, okay, so when people are living their lives based on traumatic experiences, they live that life in a certain direction. And when they are free of that, they start living their life in probably a different way, in a different direction. And I started to get excited about those possibilities. But in terms of kind of growing the business, I started out very small, just like, well, maybe there's another therapist who wants to work here kind of part-time. And it was really this organic growth. In fact, that's part of our vision is organic growth. And so it's been all people-based. So every new practice that I have opened up, actually, it's been someone in that community who has said, would you come and work here? And starting conversations and building that relationship and kind of growing it from there. So I think that might be what I say, is that for me, it's all very relationship based. And it's not like we just pick a spot and try to build something there. It's always been somebody saying, hey, would you want to come here, and working out the details to work that out.
I love that. I'm sure it was like a kind of a solidification of like, I'm supposed to be doing this type of
Yeah,
work. Yeah.
I sometimes call myself like a bumbling entrepreneur because I don't have this grand scheme and plan. Maybe more so now than I used to, but I think I was like hired one person, and then okay, it just kind of grew from there. And then somebody in Delaware said, "Do you want to open a site here?" And I was like, "I don't really know, but like let's have a conversation." So that might not be the best thing to admit, but that's the truth of how I've just sort of bumbled along into this. But I feel like that organic pathway for me kind of fits. I like to live in what I call flow and going where the energy is. And so it's really hard to plan that when you're not there. So,
I think it's neat. I really identify with that, especially I have anything in the performing arts field. I always make a joke
mm,
and tell people I've done everything that you can possibly do, from working with municipalities to art galleries to, community-wide events, museums, ballet, poetry, art, music. I've done pretty much everything that you can do in those, and I've seen different perspectives. But what I'm relating to with you is that I was a reluctant entrepreneur.
mm,
I was like in my community, like, guys, we need to do this. We need to find someone to do this. We should do this. And then people are started like, well, you should do it because no one else is doing it. So
mm,
and so once you step into those shoes, and you don't have a plan, you're just acting on passion or acting on your heart, that flow state really starts opening up to, because that's where I think all entrepreneurs should be, is in that heart space and that
mm,
connectedness to a life mission or a passion of some sort. And I think that you'll see a lot of people that do something that is a fad or something that's just to make money, Amazon, and it's great. You're making money,
mhm,
you're helping your family, but at some point you're going to lose the drive for it because sales will taper off or some new trend will come out and you'll lose that business. New technology comes out. So there's just tons of different things that I think that it's really important to be connected to a life mission of some sort. And I think a lot of people who are in that flow state where it's kind of, I remember in the movie The Secret, where they talked about the headlights only shining in the darkness for
mm,
a certain amount of view, and that's all that you had. That's all that you can comprehend on the dark road, is just the space in front of you that the headlights are lighting up, and then you just keep moving forward inch by inch. And you don't know where the next bend in the road is, but you're still moving forward. So I think, yeah, I really identify with what you're saying, and I think that's really great.
I appreciate that. Sometimes in the world of like business plans and things like that, I'm always like, I kind of missed that part of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So would love to dive more into what EMDR is, right? I had first been introduced to us from a friend that was a social worker, and
Mm,
I had experienced a couple sessions with it myself, and it's very interesting to me. So I would love for you to share like what EMDR is and why you felt it was so important to add to trauma specialists.
yeah, I love that question, Fallon. And I'm glad you've had a little bit of experience, so maybe you can see how this resonates with your experience. I first want people to know that the EMDR is a very powerful tool. And so we do have a governing body called EMDRIA, EMDRIA, the International Association. And it's important to go to trainings by someone that is supported by that and endorsed by that, and also look for that in a therapist. Like a lot of other therapies, I think people have taken bits and pieces of EMDR and put it together, and it's not necessarily the ideal, optimal way that it can be done. So I just want to put that out there first. But I think that for EMDR, the easiest way for me to say what it does, like the impact of it to someone in very basic language, is just that trauma is stored differently in our brain. And first of all, trauma is different for everyone. If the three of us experienced, it'd be hard on here, but maybe we experience somebody hack into this podcast, right? And show traumatic images, let's just say. The three of us would all react to that differently. And maybe for me, that was very traumatic and I feel like I need some help working through it. And maybe the two of you are like, listen, that was terrible, but it doesn't feel like trauma to me. So it's important to know that trauma is in the eye of the beholder, and it's actually the way that our bodies respond to something that determines whether our brains hold it differently or not. So when something happens that our bodies respond to, our brains hold it in a different place. And this is why we have things like triggers, and something might remind us of that, or we might avoid certain things because of that. All of that indicates that something's been stored in that trauma place in our brains. And so in EMDR, what we seek to do, and by the way, there's preparation for people. We don't just jump into trauma reprocessing, but sort of the meat of it is that we take we're accessing that part of the brain where the trauma is stored, and then we are letting the brain metabolize through that and process through that using all of the different parts of the brain so that it can be stored more like in long-term memory, where anything that we've had happen to us. So it desensitizes the emotionality of whatever happened or the body triggers of that. And it's fascinating to watch that happen. And really all we're doing is tapping into the body's natural way of healing, the brain's natural way of healing. Because when a trauma happens, and I mentioned that trauma space where things are held, it shuts down other parts of our brain that would normally be online to process that information. So it gets stuck in a way, and we are just opening that up, which can be difficult. I'm not saying it's the easiest thing to do, which is why we have preparation for it. We open that up though and allow the brain to fully process it. And then that is what leads to the healing. But I love this modality because we're following people's brains. We're not saying we have some answer for you in what happened. We're saying we'll help you open that up in a safe way and let your brain process through that so that you can get to the place that you need to be with it.
Yeah. I can definitely, I guess what is your range of how many sessions? I mean, I'm sure it depends on the person, but roughly like how many sessions do people go through with this EMDR therapy?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And it really does vary. I mean, I can say 1 to 50 probably is safely. When we're talking about trauma, most people don't have just one traumatic thing that happened to them in their lives. There tend to be more than one. That's certainly been true for me. So that can take longer, right? The more we have, the more our brains have to process through. And that's a lot of sort of the range for people.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. I only went for, I think, 3 or 4 sessions. So it's just really one particular instance. So I know we both we're in the same boat as you of like how many,
Multiple, yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah.
the traumas that we've experienced for sure.
Oh, yeah.
So would love to hear if there's a particular client success story with, the talk therapy and the EMDR work that you do.
I know that's a great question. And the one that came to mind this morning for me was a client who was actually referred by their neurologist. So they had had a TBI related to an accident, a car accident, and their neurologist had actually referred to me because they had done as much as they could of the actual I guess you would say physical healing of the brain in terms of the injury, but there seemed to be this real stuck point with the traumatic material, which is normal and natural to happen with a car accident. And so this client came to me and had been doing years of different types of therapy. Very, very astute, self-aware woman. And we dove into EMDR, and very quickly, kind of the amazing thing for her was how much her physical healing was linked to her emotional healing. So as we started to reprocess the traumatic aspects of this car accident, um, it was very interesting because her physical healing started to improve as well. And her doctor was seeing that. And we kind of had this team approach to it. Also interesting in her case, and part of what brings her up for me, is that as that cleared out in her brain, some of her early life kind of family traumas came up. And so sometimes it does feel like we're peeling that onion a little bit, right? And so we were then able to utilize EMDR with lots of those things, which were very pivotal. I would say probably one of the biggest things that helped her with was her parenting, because to be able to clear some of her family of origin stuff, that really allowed her to be able to parent in a way that was kind of free of those impacts. So I know I'm just giving broad strokes. I'm always careful of not sharing too much about any one client. Privacy is a big deal in therapy, as you probably know, but that's just one of so many. I could say story after story. It allows people to just not be holding on to that trauma anymore and have it be affecting them.
Yeah. I think what's really earlier, you brought up kind of the levels of trauma and the severity. Um, to equal the playing field, every person has a different threshold of what that is. But we understand, like, so we're working with a lot of veterans groups that have battlefield trauma,
Yeah.
and it's very different. Like, it's interesting. One of the veterans the other day said, we're all veterans of life. Like, even though we're veterans of war, there's people who have had wars in their own way. And I thought that was a really mature, was full of wisdom, statement. But
Wow.
at the same time, I do know that, like, someone that is here in the States and never, been in a soldier's position, it's a much, much different, because one of the things that I will say is that we can all relate that trauma is, it's damaging to anybody's, psyche, but it's also, like you said, can have effects on their physical body. And I think that there's two things in this for me that come up. One is when we give a voice to that, right? There's like a dam and it just keeps piling up and piling up. And when that final vulnerability moment happens, it's like this floodgate lets all of this stuff out. So it's like that peeling of the onion. But when we do that and we get to the other side and we start speaking out and that voice has power, it's like a beacon. It attracts other people that say, well, if this person can do that, and have success to get better, I can do that too. And I think that that's one of the coolest parts about working with people and their trauma, is that when they get through that vulnerability, that ego death, or however you want to look at it, that the curtain falls and they get to the other side and they start sharing those experiences with people. It's just neat to see the ripples of transformation that start happening on a, in a community way, when that voice becomes activated. So I think that's a really cool part of this work that we're all doing.
I love that. Thinking about there's a piece of research, and I'm not going to remember exactly who did the research, but essentially they evaluated military folks who were in active combat zones and the number of tours that they did. So with one tour, I forget the percentage, but a certain percentage of people had PTSD. Two tours, that like doubled. Three tours, 100%. And I love that statistic. I use it a lot when I'm working with first responders and things, because our humanness, our human brains, no matter how resilient that we are, 3 tours gets everybody, right? You're going to have PTSD. And I think it's important because this just impacts everyone, and it's not a failing of who you are. It's what's happening to you. And so when you were talking about that, that came up for me. And yeah, it's all of us. We all could use clearing out some traumas in our lives.
Yeah.
Um, so you've definitely had, decades of work in the trauma space and adding EMDR. Would love to know what your perception is with the treatment of trauma, like how it's evolved to what it is today.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's a great question because things have changed so much. I mean, when I first went to school as a therapist, everything was really psychodynamic, a little bit of like Freudian, kind of going back to how things impacted you. And that's kind of where I started. And then there was this big push of like cognitive behavioral stuff in the field. So that was kind of what everybody was doing. And I think treating trauma early on, the way that I was trained, and I think the way that we did it, is we said, let's just talk about it. If we just talk about it, it will make it better. And the truth is that actually doesn't work for most people. So talking about veterans, we sat veterans down for years in groups when they came back home and said, just talk about what happened to you and you'll feel better. And they didn't. And we made all sorts of reasons, we're trying to understand how the brain works. But I think where we have evolved, and I think EMDR has been a piece of this, but so other modalities as well, is how much the brain is the body. And it's funny because we hear all of this mind body and we want mind body connection, and I understand all of that. But when we're talking about, sometimes the mind is more of a spiritual construct for people. But it's all body, right? Everything that's happening. So we separate mental health and physical health. And I think it's really hilarious that we do that because it's all body. It's all our health, right? So I think we're getting better about that now. I think we have evolved as a practice of understanding. And I would say you cannot treat trauma without involving the body. You have to have a modality that does that, or you really can't treat it. Again, you can do coping skills, you can help comfort people, but you can't treat it in the way that somebody goes in and does a surgery and corrects something. And I often say EMDR is a little more like surgery, and maybe other therapy is a little more like triage, or we're just stopping the bleeding as best we can.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, when I was recommended to maybe explore the EMDR side, afterwards I had gone to a therapist that's just a cognitive behavioral therapist, just like a talk therapy. And she was like, I cannot believe you went and did that first. That's just as what you're saying, like just really intense surgery, rather than, I guess, taking the little baby steps to get to that point. I just am curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I feel like maybe that was very intuitive for you. I don't know, but that's genius from my perspective, because when we look at the parts of the brain, just very basically, we have our prefrontal cortex, which is like our highest level thinking, where we learn and where we can do CBT and talk therapy. Then we have our limbic brain, which is literally right in the center of our heads. And that's where trauma is stored. That's actually where we make most of our decisions. We want to think they're rational, but they mostly come from that middle part. And then we have the base of our brains, which is just our animal brain that keeps our heart beating and our lungs breathing and all of that. And so the interesting thing we talk about is top-down approaches in therapy rely on us having words for them, being able to express our thoughts and talk through them. But the fascinating thing is that that part of our brain gets disconnected when we're in our trauma brain, or when we're affected a lot by trauma. We're living in that limbic brain. And so for me, if you cleared your limbic brain first, that actually makes connections to your prefrontal cortex, and then you're able to process it. So it sort of makes perfect sense to me how you did it. Now, I will say that the person that you saw probably has seen people who try the talk therapy first. A lot of people try that first, find out it doesn't work, and then go to the EMDR.
Hmm.
But I kind of love the way you did that because now CBT is going to be effective for you, where I would say before it probably wouldn't have made much of an impact because you're not addressing the right part of the brain.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And
Yeah.
I feel like both of Ian and I were both like, let's just go deep. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are. I think a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to dance around doing this for a long time. Like, let's deal with it.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's interesting. So, psychedelics, people have mixed
Mm.
feelings about them, but it's definitely part of the new outlook for trauma. And especially in the veterans community that we're working in. And I think it's always interesting because it's the same way with sound, like we do sound therapy. So
Yeah.
some people are very sound sensitive, and then other people are like, turn it up, give me level 10, And it's the same, I think, in psychedelics. There's people who do very micro dosing and very
Mm.
small. And then there's people that are like, let's go on a trip, it's like, and so and I think that with that kind of diversity, you have to be skilled as a practitioner to be able to have the experiences with both and be able to be a good middle ground and a sounding board for people that are getting into this. Specifically, like I'm referring to the veterans community, like sound therapy can be very, very healing, but it can also be very intense, especially when you're getting into lower frequencies that really
Mm.
resonate with the body tissue, bone, and just the flesh of the human body, because a lot of traumas are stored in there. So when you start moving stagnant energy that way, it can be very overwhelming for people in different ways. And so I think like we have done our best to really meet people where they are. And then I have taken the approach of a lot of hypnotherapists who kind of start downshifting, so you're dropping people in without them even really knowing it. And you're just kind of going slow and baby steps to the point where they're like, oh, I feel relaxed. This really worked. And I think that those types of therapies, and it sounds like what you guys are doing is very similar. It's like you are going deep, but you're doing it in a way that doesn't feel as deep to them right off the bat. It's something that's kind of downshifting and kind of gradually bringing them into a place where they're setting in the trauma. And instead of just dropping them straight in, it's like they've been downshifted into that trauma where they can actually look around and say, I don't really want this stuff in my body anymore, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you bring up a good point. I think that is so important is we have it, we call it a preparation phase in EMDR, and we like to spend the most time there in terms of making sure someone is ready, has all the pieces in place to where it's not going to be too much. But I feel like the choice is always the person who's coming to therapy. So I think our job is to explain what we have to offer, and then they get to choose when that happens, when they're ready, what they need, along with their therapist, of course. But I think that's the beauty for me is that it's not my decision. It's not my body. It's not
Yeah.
my healing journey.
Mhm.
So they get to decide what's right for them.
Hmm.
I will say, just to kind of close on this, is that I think in Western society, everybody wants everything to be happy and magical. And when you really look at people who have made something of themselves and entrepreneurs or personally, almost every time you have that hero's journey story, right? Where someone has been through the depths of hell and you can't really tell anymore, right? They're on the other side of it. But it was part of their story that made them stronger, made them learn to be more resilient. And I think that everybody wants that, but they want it to be this magical unicorn of, softness and peacefulness and love. And I think that that's part of the journey. But I think a lot of people are not looking at the shadow, and the shadow is such a huge part of healing. And that shadow comes to you through relationships. That shadow comes to you through jobs and work relationships. It comes to you through media, the things that you're taking in. And I think a lot of the spiritual communities where I'm really kind of shining this light is, everything is, peace, love, and namaste. And I think that, we're really missing a major component of the full spectrum of healing in that when we do that, you know?
I think you're very right about that. For in my line of work, this the idea of parts. We all have all parts of self, right? And that shadow self, or a part of us that might hold a lot of anger or whatever that doesn't feel like it's um, happy, joy, right? But anger is so important. If I could have $1 for every time I've said this in a therapy session, anger is self-protective. We should be glad that we're feeling anger and that we have that inside of us. It's how our bodies tell us that something is not right. Now, I'm not at all endorsing what we might go out and do, like what we're responsible for what we do with that, but the feeling itself of anger and tapping into that, to your point, and being aware of us helps us set great boundaries. Just as an example of, I agree with you that if you think of the full range of emotions or watching the movie Inside Out, and we have all the different emotions, only one of them is this joy character, right? Most of them have a flavor of the dark side or the shadow self. And we would say that those are the ones we don't want to feel, but look at that of all of them. Most of them are more uncomfortable feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's how we're wired.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I love how you brought in parts work. We had watched Inside Out too, just a couple days ago, but it's really pivotal. I absolutely encourage everybody to watch that movie because it gets you to see, certainly towards the end, it's almost like you can see how everybody works together to
Yeah.
create who you are and the decisions that you make. So if we can befriend these parts of us that maybe we've shunned before, I'm certain that we can regulate our hormonal system, our nervous system, etc.
Mm.
Would love to know if there's correlation between trauma work, like say if somebody is an emotional eater or has like that different relationship with food that's not really harmonious. Do you feel like EMDR and this type of therapy can help people kind of come back into a better relationship with food? I'm kind of trying to tie that emotional piece with the physical, right?
Definitely. This, for some people might go a little out of what you typically think of for therapy, but it makes me think of a specific client that had that struggle that I worked with. And as we do, sometimes we accidentally find what works. But in this client's particular case, we were doing what we call a pre-verbal protocol. So it's going through things that may have happened at a very young age. And that for her was where that trauma was stored. And it was very related to early life experiences of not having enough to eat. And as we processed through that, it completely changed her relationship with food instantaneously. I'm not saying that it was suddenly a miracle and that she never struggled anymore, but she had this understanding of where it came from and how her brain had processed it. And it wasn't just almost like an instinct that just happened anymore. She had enough space between it to be able to be like, okay, this is what's coming up. This is what I can do. And now I have choice in this behavior. Um,
Mhm.
it was pretty profound. So yeah, I've definitely seen that with that particular set of symptoms.
That's really cool and pivotal because I starting in my own journey, right? I was more into the physical health and eating more high quality foods. And then it kind of was like, oh, you have to deal with this other part, which I had no
Mm.
conscious um construct of what that meant, right? It just seemed like trauma. No, I don't have that, right? And I'm sure you might get a lot of people that like, no, nothing like happened to me. I'm fine. And it's almost like you have to have that hard look with yourself of recognizing. I think the more that you eat well, your sleep hygiene is better, like your rest, etc., the more that you become aware of yourself and you're able to kind of look at yourself from a different perspective. It's almost like your higher self is kind of looking down on you and saying like, this is actually something that's hurting me right now, or this is something that I need to go deeper into. And it really does take that courageous person to handle it and deal with it and not let it continue to fester and, impact their relationships and, whether that be the partner, the parents, friends, coworkers, etc. And I do definitely feel like as the years go on, the stigma around therapy is lessening, right? People are being
Oh, for sure.
more open to it, which is beautiful. But I don't know, I don't have a question there. But would love to um see, kind of shift gears here because I know we're coming up on time shortly, maybe about 8 or so minutes. But
Mm,
um, as far as you have your own podcast, so you're
yeah.
not only you have 3 locations of trauma, the trauma specialists locations, excuse me, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, but you also have your own podcast and would love to hear from your perspective how you specifically approach mental health professionals and talking about the unique challenges and the rewards of being a mental health type of entrepreneur, right? Like what insights have you gained from your podcast, from your 26 years and thereafter?
Oh, that's like a huge question.
It is,
I'll
I'm
try to
sorry.
be brief, okay? I'm like, okay, let's take this one piece at a time. Um, there is so much. So this podcast, I started this year, really in January, because I wanted to really highlight innovation in our industry and mental health care in the broader sense, like mental wellness is kind of how I say that. And so I was really looking to bring people on that were doing innovative, creative things, which you all are, and I can't wait to have you on my podcast. But that came from a place of really we have always had a waiting list. We have always not been able to serve the number of people, and that has been what has fueled that growth for us. And it's like, what else can we do? We aren't the only answer, right? If we have only so many therapists, the more therapists I hire, I still have a waiting list, right? It feels like this impossible to fill the need kind of situation. And that was sort of where the podcast came from. And so some of what I've been really inspired by is how people in fields that are completely different from mine are doing things that support mental wellness. And that has been some of the most exciting and fun things that I have learned. And I feel like as human beings, we need to maybe expand what mental wellness is and all the different places we can find that. And it's not just inpatient in a hospital or outpatient therapy. We have our roles in this for sure. But there aren't enough of us to fill the need. And so helping people find other things and innovative things that they're doing was kind of the mission of that podcast. Interestingly enough, I think in our field right now, one of the things that is happening is we're getting a lot of people that are venture capitalist companies or tech companies, as we've kind of shown the light on mental health, that are doing mental health in a different way, training AI to be someone's therapist, trying to reduce cost and get cheaper therapy and all of that. And while I understand the pull to make it more accessible, I think one of the things that I've realized, and maybe where my podcast might be going heading forward, is that these are 2 different types of things we're talking about. A lot of people that are doing therapy on these online platforms where someone might text you in response or email you, or it's not the same thing as when we're sitting down in person and doing actual deep trauma work. And so I think there's a lot of need for education in the field about what's what, because the average person says a therapist is a therapist is a therapist. And I think that's not happening anymore. I think there's such different pockets of what people are doing that you can't just go to a therapist and then go to another therapist. Those two experiences are probably going to be completely different. So I think we need to be thinking about how we educate people about what is available in the mental health space. But I'm an abundance mindset person, and I think what therapy works for some people, and I think other things work for other people. So I think we need to sort of broaden the scope of what we look at as a nation in terms of what is best for people and how do we support communities, because it's not just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a really great point. And the suits, man. Right. So what I mean by that is like the monopolies and the stranglehold that a lot of
Mm,
these money-driven platforms have is that they want to show you like this is the form that you need and it's the cheapest and it's the best and it's the blah blah blah, right? And the problem with that is, like at one point there used to be like 7,000 potato varieties and all of them had
mm.
different makeups nutritionally, and then we got into industrial farming and it went down to like 7 varieties of potato.
Wow.
And so apples are the same way. And so when you start realizing that each of these apples had different makeup and when you eat them
Mm,
they give your body different nutrients, you can see the need for that variety was intended. God gave us this plan of all these different seeds to use for a reason. And then the suits came along and said, we only need 7. And so I think that playing God with people, I think you're exactly right. I think diversity and the option to have a choice, a true choice, not a company that owns 32 varieties of the same thing, but
mm,
32 different companies that are offering unique, individualized, customized experiences that are heart centered. They have gone through something, they would like you to heal the way that they have. I think this kind of connection AI will never be able to replace. And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs come to us asking us different things about the successes of our business, and one of the things that we're constantly telling holistic practitioners is you have to engage in community. The one-on-one is where you will never be replaced. It doesn't matter what technology is coming out. The Zoom call will never be as good as being in person. It does help if that's all you have, but
sure.
bear tax down to the bottom line. It's like that interaction with community and the interaction one-on-one will never be replaced. It's something that is very rooted in our DNA, that we need that observation and perspective and just loving supportive environments.
Yeah. I wanted to add on that quick. It's reminds me of the age of intuition. We're coming out with a like a course on that, and it's almost like people being overwhelmed with there's so much information out there. I don't know what to believe. But then, it's always that, double-sided coin, right? Where you have all of these options and then you feel overwhelmed, where it's like, I don't know what to choose. And I think it's really forcing us to check in with our intuition and being like, if I try
Mm,
this, this isn't going to quote save me, right? But everything's information, everything messages, right? And each of us as practitioners or therapists, right, we are guiding people back to themselves, right? Back to this
yes.
harmonious state.
Yes.
And it's never going to be, you're going to win the marathon, right? It's never going to be that one thing. It's this continuous journey, this continuous unfolding. And
Mm,
that's the beauty of life, because you're learning more about yourself as you continue to age and evolve, or who you interact with. So I think everything is, in a sense, can help us bring us back to ourselves, right? That age of intuition concept.
I love that concept because I think you're right. There's so much out there right now for us, if people looked to the news at a certain time in our history for information, that might have made sense. Now it depends on which news you listen to, what the actual information is that you get, or if you're going online and who's producing this, and is this an AI produced fake picture or is this a real picture? I mean, there is so much, and you're absolutely right, using that intuitive sense that we all have and honing that is a great answer to that. I love it.
Um, so wrapping up, you think? Yeah.
Yeah.
So would love to hear if you can share any advice or experience from your own personal journey that has shaped you as both a therapist and an entrepreneur. Because we're curious, if people are thinking about getting into this type of work, whether it be professionally or personally, right? Just any piece of advice you could give somebody to look at things a little bit differently.
I think the biggest thing I have learned, I would say in both of those arenas, is that you can't be anybody except who you are. And by that, I mean like really kind of piggybacking off of that intuitive self, you can only do what feels true to you. I think it's really easy in the therapist journey to think you go to school and you learn how to be this healer and you hear from different people and you see different people and you're like, oh, they're amazing. But being a therapist is also just very much about who you are and your own journey. And you bring that into the session and you can't not. Like, there is a lot of training that tries to teach therapists to not bring that into session, but we aren't robots, we are humans. So sitting with me is a match for some people, and for other people they're like, yeah, you're not the right fit for me. And that has a lot to do with just what I naturally bring, like who I am. And I think the very same thing is true in the entrepreneur journey. It's really easy, especially now, to get out there and see like on social media or whatever and what people are doing and thinking that you need to do the things that other people are doing that worked for them. And I just don't find that to be true. I think it's hard to constantly fight back to self, but you have to do you have to be who you are. And I say that to myself a lot of times when I come into situations where I'm speaking or whatever, and people will say, are you nervous? And I might have a little anxiety, but at the end of the day, I'm like, but this is what I tell myself. I can only bring what I am and what I have to say. Like, there's just nothing more I can do. I'm just me. So here it is. And it is what it is. I think it can reduce a lot of the anxiety and also help people do what they're meant to do, because we're not all meant to just replicate each other. And if we did that, I think we would miss healing and helping people both through businesses and through treatment opportunities, because we're trying to be like everybody else. So I guess it's maybe resisting that, trying to be like everybody else, and do what you sort of know is your own flow and intuitive sense of who you are and what you want to bring to the world.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I can totally relate to that. I know there's a little bit of an age gap between Ian and I, and sometimes we see it more prominent than others, but he is very confident in his process, in his journey. And I think maybe for even myself sometimes and the younger generation that maybe have quote, a lot of work to do. I know that we all have a lot of work to do, but
We all do.
maybe we haven't delved into anything yet where it's like, well, I don't know who I am. Maybe I'm more like
Mm,
Sabrina. Maybe I'm more like Shannon. I don't know, but it's almost like when you do the work, you get to find out more of who you are. Then you become confident because your answer was just with such confidence. And you can definitely tell that you've done a lot of work on yourself and for other people. So it's definitely like taking that step, and you're not always going to be right, but it's the right direction to get you to the other spot, you know?
mhm, mhm. Yeah, awesome.
It's very cool. Yeah, I would almost say failures give you more insight to who you are.
100%. It's so terrible, right? Because we want to avoid those. We do. It's natural to avoid them, but yeah, failure is a great teacher.
Yeah. Yeah.
So would love, thank you so much for your time, first of all. Would love to know where people can find you. Certainly we'll have everything in the show notes, but if you have anything upcoming, like whether events or anything that you'd like us to promote in the show notes, or anything that you'd like to share in closing of this episode.
I appreciate that. Yeah, so Trauma Specialist of Pennsylvania is right by you, and Maryland and Delaware. We have offices too. And then our Trauma Training Institute, we have trainings for all kinds of people, mostly therapists, but training for admin staff, for example, to be trauma informed, things like that. So if you want to check out our traumaspecialisttraining.com website, that's where you can find a lot of our offerings. So I just want to say too, this has been an amazing podcast. I feel like it's been a great connection. I feel like we've connected on important things, both to our work and also to who I am as a person. So thank you. It's been a really awesome experience to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on today.